On today's History of Politics, I want to talk to you about the political parties. There's a lot of confusion about who's who in America and where it started, what it started out as, and where we are today. So, we're talking the history of politics. Let's get into the history of politics right here with the history of political parties. When the founders, the framers of the Constitution, settled this country, they came from England on the Mayflower. In fact, yesterday was the anniversary of the day that the Mayflower set sail from Britain. The expedition was paid for by the crown, the royalty, of course. And that date was 1620, September 16th of 1620. When they came here, they settled this land. And remember, Christopher Columbus had nothing to do with it. Christopher Columbus never set foot in America proper. He shipwrecked the Santa Maria off the coast of Hispaniola, which is now the Dominican Republic and Haiti. Anywho, it was decided that we would exercise a Republican form of society, aka a democracy. What makes a Republican society? This is the first question. A Republican society is not a conservative society. Let's clear that up right now. A Republican society is a society that's rooted in democracy, where its governmental leaders are elected by the people. That is a Republican society. The leaders of the society, the government, are elected by the people. And interestingly enough, if you weren't aware, but those migrants from Great Britain that came here to settle this country, to settle this land, they had kind of a mishap. They were looking to go to Virginia, but in actuality, they wound up in Massachusetts. And they named the place where they started to settle Plymouth, Massachusetts. And they continued to come. And the bottom line was that they were in the North. Now, as the country started to grow and we started to take on more of the southern territories, that land needed to be built also. The settlers tried to use the indigenous population here to do this, but they failed. The indigenous population suffered a lot with this country. There was some bartering done, yes, and in my opinion, they were taken advantage of. That's why they have received certain reparations and federal treaties and so on, and they have their own land at this point because of what was taken from them. Over the course of time, they fought back and they were not going to be enslaved. They were very proud people and they were not going to do the bidding of this white man that came from across the water. Needing somebody to do the work, the slave trade was the perfect answer. And the people in the South continued in that trade. Now, here's where things get sloppy. This country was settled in the North, from Massachusetts down to Pennsylvania, Philadelphia. During those times, the politicians of those days were called Republicans because we used a republic society. Since it was a republic society that worked in democracy, they called themselves Republicans. George Washington, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Republicans. Abraham Lincoln, Republican. However, in the South, a new party was formed. They called themselves the Democrats. And later on, changed their name to the Whigs. And in the course of all of that, after the Civil War, became a party shift. And here's what the party shift entailed. The Southern states who enjoyed the benefits of the slave trade, but also consisted of the more wealthy landowners, became today the Republican Party of late. The more enlightened people from the North became the Democrats. The values changed. Now, I know you've heard it said more than once that Democrats promoted slavery. They founded slavery. That's true, but it's not true. And here's why. Because the ancestors of today's Republican Party were those very Democrats. You see, the whole facade of the grand old party, or the GOP, is false. Because it's not the same party. Today's Republican Party is not the party of Lincoln. The value system changed. How did it change? Because the Southerners wanted to hold on to slavery. This is why we had a civil war. The North did not want that. The North wanted to abolish slavery. So the Southerners didn't want to do that, because what would happen? They would lose free labor and money. And that's why you had a civil war. Because they wanted to secede from the Union and have their own country. The war was fought, and the South wound up giving up, surrendering to the Union Army. The Confederates were beaten, and the 13th and 14th Amendments were passed to keep this from happening again. But the people in the South wanted to keep things status quo, and they became conservatives. They wanted to conserve, or to keep what they had. They were a party of wealth and power, and they became today's Republican Party. Whereas the Northern Republicans, their value system changed as well, where they became a little bit more accepting of people of color. I'm giving it to you very basic today. Very basic. This is the basics of it. You could do your own research, because it's a lot more involved how these shifts transpired over the course of time. In truth, even since the days of Lincoln, the Republican Party is different. Because, yes, the Republicans did a great many things in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, hell, even the early 1960s. But now, the Republican Party has shifted yet again, where they're more along the lines of the Whigs. The Democrats have changed too, because they're not exactly following the tenets of the framers and the founders. They're not standing up for justice the way that they should. See, you have a couple of different influences here. First of all, there has to be a separation, and it's in the Constitution, in the First Amendment, that there shall not be a national religion. Congress shall not establish a national religion. That's what's called the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. And I'm sorry to tell some of you that even though the settlers who came here from Britain were Protestants, this is not a Christian country. The Constitution forbids it. It follows the ideology of the separation of church and state. And to be honest with you, any true Christian knows that you can't be a politician and, per se, a minister of the gospel at the same time, because politicians and politics tend to ask for compromise for the general peace of the people. And that compromise can conflict with your religious beliefs. And if you can't handle that, stay out of politics. It doesn't mean that the Democrats are amoral. It doesn't mean that Republicans are amoral. It means that there is a separation of church and state. And this is not a Christian nation. And as the First Amendment allows for you to practice your faith base unto yourself freely, if you want to pray in the park for as yourself, great. But you can't stop a Muslim from doing his salat. You can't stop a Buddhist from chanting to himself. He has that right. But back to the political parties. The worst influences in these parties has taken place in the last decade. And in that last decade, I find two specific errors. The first one is the MAGA movement. The MAGA movement, in trying to gain traction and power, has aligned itself with white nationalists and white supremacists. They're deadly wrong. When you have one group of people who tries to exalt itself over another, there is a problem. We are all Americans. You were born here, you went through the tests, and you were naturalized here. You are an American. Plain and simple. We are stronger together than divided. United we stand, divided we fall. And a house divided cannot stand. That's in the Bible. For you who claim to be Christians, I might remind you that God, who sits on high and looks low, looks down at us and says, my creations, period. The Bible itself says God is irrespective of class. The rich are not better than the poor. In fact, the Bible has more deference to widows, children, disabled, the weak, the hungry, the homeless, the poor. God gives them favor. God does not care about your wealth because it belongs to him anyway. The MAGA movement has aligned itself with the wrong people and caused a separation. On the other hand, the Democratic Party has let a little bit too much slip under the door. Look, I have opinions, but I cannot judge anybody. I do not have the power of life and death. I cannot send anybody's soul to heaven or to hell. I understand that, and I'm good with that. I prefer it. I don't want that responsibility anyway. That's God's and God alone's. But here's the thing. When you have, from what I've been told, when you have schools that are catering to people who identify as animals to the degree that you're putting out litter boxes for them to use, that's a little beyond the pale for me. If you want to be gay, if you want to be a transgender, I personally don't live that lifestyle, nor do I want to, nor am I curious about it. I know a sufficient amount because I read and I talk to people. But Jesus said that I am to love my neighbor. So here we are. I'm not going to judge you for exercising that lifestyle. Just leave me out of it. But if you're trying to enforce it on other people, yes, teach people to respect those that practice that lifestyle. But by the same token, don't encourage it. In other words, try to change somebody from who they are. And the Democrats do sometimes kind of let a lot of people in through the cracks that they shouldn't let in, or let them get away with things that they shouldn't get away with. You know, listen, Nancy Mace has a thing. She says, well, I was raped and I don't want a transgender. I mean, I think she's really over the top personally. It's her opinion. She can have that. But you can't run government policy that way from your own personal feelings. The solution is just make a third bathroom for transgenders. That's the easiest solution instead of all this hatred and vitriol that's going on. Let them do what they do. Give them their own bathroom to do it. The bottom line is this. The parties have shifted their views over the course of time. The grand old party of today is not the grand old party of Lincoln or the grand old party of Washington. It's just not. The Democratic Party is not the Whigs or their original creation in the southern states at the formation of this country. Everybody's different. But what I do look at is this. Men in suits have destroyed what men in denim have built. This is why I've always argued for term limits. Because I don't need, we're living in 2025. We're in the 25th year of the 21st century. Times have changed. I don't need your values from the 1950s, your racism, your prejudices. I don't need those today in my lawmaking. We need to rewrite the old laws and make them comparable for today's circumstance. We need to grow and expand, not demonize and divide. That's why, just food for thought, I'm an independent. I am not aligned to a party. As you know, I'm running for political office. I'm not going to align to a party because if the party wants me to do X and I don't like X, I'm not beholden to them to do it. I'm free to be me. Maybe a lot more people need to be that way. But this is the party changes. This is the history of the political parties. If you learned something today, comment respectfully, because if you don't, if it's disrespectful, you're going to get it back and you're going to get blocked and deleted. Otherwise, like, share, and we'll talk to you tomorrow. See you on the next one.